The statement that isolated ground receptacles installed in non-metallic boxes must be covered with a non-metallic faceplate because a metal faceplate cannot be grounded to the circuit equipment grounding conductor is false. Exception to National Electrical Code Section 406.2 D2 states for isolated ground receptacles installed in non-metallic boxes, a metal faceplate shall be permitted where the receptacle is connected to a circuit that has a ground fault circuit interrupter. This exception permits the use of a metallic faceplate on a non-metallic box when the receptacle is connected to a circuit protected by a ground fault circuit interrupter. This means that the ground fault circuit interrupter protection allows for the metal faceplate to be used, even if the box itself is non-metallic and might not inherently provide a grounding path for the faceplate. The key here is the presence of the ground fault circuit interrupter protection in the circuit. The National Electrical Code does not mandate the use of a non-metallic faceplate on a non-metallic box in all scenarios involving isolated ground receptacles. The exception specifically allows for metal faceplates under certain conditions, notably when ground fault circuit interrupter protection is in place. Now let's delve a little deeper into why this exception exists and how it works in practice. Firstly, the primary concern with using a metal faceplate on a non-metallic box without proper grounding is the risk of electrical shock. If a live wire were to come into contact with the metal faceplate, and there's no grounding path, anyone touching the faceplate could receive a shock. Secondly, a ground fault circuit interrupter is a safety device designed to quickly interrupt a circuit when it detects a ground fault, which is an unintended electrical path between a live conductor and ground. This rapid interruption minimizes the risk of electric shock. The exception in Section 406.2 D2 is based on the understanding that the ground fault circuit interrupter provides a sufficient level of protection, even if the metal faceplate isn't directly grounded to the equipment grounding conductor. The ground fault circuit interrupter will trip quickly enough to prevent a dangerous shock. Let's consider a practical scenario. Imagine a non-metallic box housing an isolated ground receptacle in a workshop. The circuit feeding the receptacle is protected by a ground fault circuit interrupter. According to the exception, you would be allowed to use a metal faceplate on this box, even though the box itself is non-metallic. The ground fault circuit interrupter is providing the necessary safety net in case of a fault. Now, it's important to note that while the code permits this, it doesn't mean it's always the best practice. Depending on the specific application and environment, a non-metallic faceplate might still be a preferable choice for added safety and to avoid any potential for corrosion or other issues. Also, even with the ground fault circuit interrupter protection, it's crucial to ensure that the receptacle itself is properly installed and wired according to code requirements. This includes ensuring that the isolated ground conductor is properly connected and that all other wiring connections are secure. It's also worth mentioning that local codes or regulations may have additional requirements or restrictions regarding the use of metal faceplates in certain situations. Always consult with your local electrical inspector to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. In summary, the National Electrical Code provides flexibility in the choice of faceplate material for isolated ground receptacles in non-metallic boxes as long as ground fault circuit interrupter protection is provided. The presence of the ground fault circuit interrupter mitigates the risk associated with using a metal faceplate that isn't directly grounded to the equipment grounding conductor. Always prioritize safety and consult with qualified professionals to ensure that all electrical installations are performed correctly and in accordance with applicable codes. Furthermore, it's good to understand the intent behind these code requirements. The National Electrical Code is not just a set of rules, it's a collection of best practices developed over many years to ensure electrical safety. Each requirement and exception is based on sound engineering principles and real-world experience. By understanding the reasoning behind the code, you can make more informed decisions about electrical installations and better protect yourself and others from electrical hazards. For example, the isolated ground receptacle itself is designed to minimize electrical noise and interference in sensitive electronic equipment. It achieves this by providing a separate grounding path for the equipment, isolated from the normal equipment grounding conductor. This can be particularly important in applications such as audio recording studios, medical facilities, and data centers, where clean power is essential. However, the isolated ground feature also introduces a potential safety concern. Because the isolated ground conductor is not directly connected to the equipment grounding conductor, the receptacle, there is a risk that it could become energized if a fault occurs. This is why the National Electrical Code requires special attention to be paid to the installation and wiring of isolated ground receptacles. The exception allowing metal faceplates with ground fault circuit interrupter protection is a practical compromise that balances the need for electrical safety with the desire for flexibility in design and material choices. It allows for the use of durable and aesthetically pleasing metal faceplates in situations where the risk of electrical shock is minimized by the presence of the ground fault circuit interrupter. Finally, always remember that electrical work can be dangerous. If you are not a qualified electrician, it's best to leave electrical installations and repairs to the professionals. Working with electricity requires specialized knowledge and skills, and making a mistake can have serious consequences. If you are a qualified electrician, always follow safe work practices and use appropriate personal protective equipment. This includes wearing insulated gloves, safety glasses, and other necessary gear. And always double-check your work to ensure that it is safe and compliant with all applicable codes and regulations. By taking these precautions, you can help prevent electrical accidents and ensure the safety of yourself and others. Okay, let's discuss some additional points related to isolated ground receptacles, non-metallic boxes, and faceplate options, with a continued focus on the electrical code and safe practices. When dealing with isolated ground systems, it's crucial to understand that the isolated ground conductor must be run all the way back to the electrical panel board, without any intermediate connections to the regular equipment grounding conductor. This dedicated path ensures that the sensitive equipment connected to the isolated ground receptacle has a clean, noise-free ground reference. If the isolated ground conductor is inadvertently connected to the regular equipment grounding conductor at some point along its path, it defeats the purpose of the isolated ground system and can introduce noise and interference. Therefore, careful attention must be paid to the routing and termination of the isolated ground conductor. In addition to the ground fault circuit interrupter protection allowed by the exception in section 406.2 D2, there are other safety measures that can be taken to further reduce the risk of electrical shock when using metal faceplates on non-metallic boxes. One option is to use a grounding screw or pigtail to connect the metal faceplate to the equipment grounding conductor. This provides a direct grounding path for the faceplate, even if the box itself is non-metallic. However, it's important to ensure that the grounding screw or pigtail is properly sized and securely connected to both the faceplate and the equipment grounding conductor. Another option is to use a metal box with a non-metallic faceplate. This provides the best of both worlds: a solid metal enclosure that is properly grounded to the equipment grounding conductor, and a non-metallic faceplate that eliminates the risk of shock from the faceplate itself. However, this option may not be suitable for all applications, as it can be more expensive and may not be aesthetically desirable in some cases. When selecting a non-metallic box for use with an isolated ground receptacle, it's important to choose a box that is listed for that purpose. Some non-metallic boxes are not designed to accommodate isolated ground receptacles and may not have the necessary provisions for mounting and wiring the receptacle. Look for boxes that are specifically labeled as being suitable for use with isolated ground receptacles. In addition to the requirements for faceplates and boxes, the National Electrical Code also has specific requirements for the wiring of isolated ground receptacles. The isolated ground conductor must be insulated with green insulation and must be run separately from the regular equipment grounding conductor. The isolated ground conductor must also be terminated at a dedicated terminal in the electrical panel board. When installing isolated ground receptacles, it's important to use the correct wiring methods and materials. This includes using properly sized conductors, approved connectors, and appropriate wiring techniques. Improper wiring can lead to electrical hazards and can also degrade the performance of the isolated ground system. It's also important to periodically inspect isolated ground systems to ensure that they are functioning properly. This includes checking the wiring connections, testing the ground fault circuit interrupter, and verifying the integrity of the isolated ground conductor. Any problems that are identified should be corrected promptly to prevent electrical hazards and maintain the performance of the system. The use of metal faceplates on non-metallic boxes is a common practice in many electrical installations. However, it's important to understand the potential risks and to take appropriate safety measures to mitigate those risks. By following the requirements of the National Electrical Code and by using good electrical practices, you can ensure that these installations are safe and reliable. In conclusion, when dealing with isolated ground receptacles, non-metallic boxes, and faceplate options, it's essential to have a thorough understanding of the National Electrical Code and to follow safe electrical practices. The exception in Section 406.2 D2 allows for the use of metal faceplates on non-metallic boxes when ground fault circuit interrupter protection is provided. However, it's important to consider all of the factors involved and to choose the option that is best suited for the specific application. And always remember that electrical work can be dangerous, so if you are not a qualified electrician, it's best to leave these tasks to the professionals.